Hello, and thanks for the invitation and greetings from Sweden. Today I have the honor or the pleasure to present you the recent discoveries from the Hans Romberg Tectonic Laboratory here in Uppsala, and how we make the invisible visible, how we visualize the invisible deformation in our models, or in other words, how we use the magnetic fabric in models to reveal the deformation. And before I start to speak about the models and these fancy, colorful plots, I will briefly speak about the basics behind magnetic fabric analysis and what you should know to understand what we are doing. The anisotropy of magnetic susceptibility, short AMS, is a very useful tool which is established since more than 70, 80 years by Ising in the 40s and Graham in the 50s. As a useful tool for structural geologists to quantify strain in the field. And then there's a bunch of papers in the 80s and 90s of several co-workers and as researchers to develop this methodology even further in order to use this in the field to quantify strain. And how does it work? You have to imagine that every grain, every mineral has the ability being magnetized in an applied magnetic field. So you apply a magnetic field to a mineral or a grain, and you can measure the response, the magnetization. And the relation between the magnetization and the applied field is called the magnetic susceptibility. And this magnetic susceptibility is different in different directions. You apply the field on a grain, on a mineral, kind of like an anisotropy. And these can be broken down, simply said, in kind of an ellipsoid, a magnetic ellipsoid with a principal axis like a maximum axis of susceptibility, intermediate axis, and the minimum axis. And these axes luckily correspond with the the maximum axis of susceptibility corresponds with the long axis of the grain, which is very helpful because this gives you an idea of how grains are oriented. And knowing that, you can plot this in a lower hemisphere eco-area projection, like this stereographic projection, where you have in this case, like a magnetic or a maximum axis pointing to the southeast, intermediate axis pointing towards the southwest, and the minimum axis, which is almost vertically. And to note is that the maximum axis and the intermediate axis define the so-called magnetic foliation, which is important for one of our results later on. However, knowing the orientation of the grains, we can go to the field, take samples, which is done now over the last, as I said, like 70, 80 years. And we know that undeformed rocks have a sedimentary fabric, having the minimum axis being vertically and the maximum axis, these squares, distributed around the primitive circle. And if you increase deformation, you start to reorient these different axes so that the maximum axis goes perpendicular to the shortening direction. So let's say that the shortening direction is in x direction, so east-west. Then you start to cluster the maximum axis perpendicular to it, to the shortening direction. And then also the minimum axis starts to rotate away towards parallelism with the shortening direction. And then you get a tectonic fabric. But I have to say, when you take samples, then you do not measure single grains or the orientation of the single grains. What you measure is the bulk susceptibility. So all grains in a sample contribute to the overall magnetic signal. And you can introduce further parameters like the degree of anisotropy, called P, where you divide the maximum axis by the minimum axis. And there you get a kind of a sorting of the grains within your sample. So if all grains are aligned, then, or all long axes pointing to the same direction, you get a very high degree of anisotropy, whereas like bad sorting gives you a low degree of anisotropy. And you can plot this in a so-called Jelinek plot, the degree of anisotropy against the shape of anisotropy. And this is coming from, as you're familiar with in structural geology, the Flynn plots with oblate shape and prolate shapes, these pancakes and cigars. And what scientists or researchers, geoscientists recognize is that you have an undeformed oblate shape, and with increasing deformation, you decrease the degree of anisotropy, creating a prolate fabric, and then with increasing shortening, increasing strain, you come back into the oblate field, producing high degree of anisotropies. This is known from the field, and we were wondering if we can use this as well in analog models. So having a very simple workflow, we have a basic setup of our analog models, model. Here we have like on the top view, like glass walls on the side, and then a backstop, which is driven by a motor into the model. Then we fill it with sand. So we have, with a scraper, we homogenize like layer for layer for layer, putting like some colored sand layers in between to have some passive marker. Then we can also put on the surface of the model, we can put some other strain markers, and you can observe the deformation when you start deforming or shortening the model. You can observe the deformation with a laser scanner or with some cameras. And this is something what Timothy was speaking, I think, in one of the last seminars, MSL seminars, which you can also check out on YouTube. Then when you have deformed the model, then we carefully wet the model. So we put some, we wet the model in order to get a certain stiffness that we can cut our sand. I have to mention that we not only use sand, this is a sand magnetite mixture, and we use magnetite as the main contributor of the magnetic signal in our models. That this wet material has a cohesion that is very stiff, and you can cut this sandbox model like a cake. And then you can look into the model, and we carefully press our AMS samples into the model, and then afterwards we measure with a Kappa bridge the magnetic susceptibility. So, and now the question, how does it work? Well, does it work in our analog models? Simply said, yes, it works. And one of the key studies made by Bjarne Almqvist and Hemming Koy in 2018 was the basis for my PhD project, which I'm currently working on, is that they had a simply fault and trust belt model. Looking from the top, pressed several samples in the model, and that they observe that in the foreland, which is undeformed, they get the initial fabric, so a fabric which is undeformed. But we have to mention that due to scraping, so we scrape with a metal scrape layer for layer in the model, and that you get a kind of artificial alignment where the maximum axis, so the squares are plotting north-south due to this alignment with parallel to the scraping. But when you go to the transition zone, then you observe from the strain markers on top, there is some deformation going on, and you see some scattering of the principal axis, and even more in the hinterland where you see already thrusts and folds, and where the previous circles are turned into ellipses, you have a much higher scattering in our plots. And when you plot the degree of anisotropies, these p-values, so the kind of sorting of the grains against the distance from the foreland towards the hinterland, then you observe, as Hemming and Bjarne has run several models, like 4 models in this case, you observe that towards the hinterland, you decrease the degree of anisotropy. And this is like cross-checked as well with the strain marker analysis, where they checked the ellipticity of the circles or ellipses from the surface of the model. And you observe that towards the hinterland, this ellipticity is increasing, so that there's lots of deformation in the hinterland, and this is reflected by the magnetic fabric. Not going so far into detail, we have to get more, not far getting into the detail of the study, but we have to get more into the detail of this methodology and develop it further. So we created a bit more complicated model, so 2 frictional model where we shortened with a backstop a model above a high friction sandpaper, and above on the other side, beneath the green area, the model above low frictional sand fiberglass. And here we also refined a bit more the technology or the methodology. We used less magnetite in the sand. We still get a strong signal, and we even decreased the size of the sample in order to target the structures which develop. And when you look now on the top view, so the backstop is pushing into the model, is something what you already know from, which is already known, that above the high friction, you create a high topography with a stack of imbricates, whereas above the low friction, the deformation penetrated even farther into the foreland, and you create a deflection zone in the middle. This is something known, but we were interested in the magnetic fabric. So looking at the high friction decomo on the blue side, we have in the foreland, we have still this initial fabric. So the maximum lineation plotting towards the north-south and came in vertically. And when you look in the hinterland, where we have this lot of like thrust imbricates stacked on top of each other with a high topography, we observe that this magnetic foliation, so the triangles and the squares, are aligning with the thrust surface. So our magnetic fabric is depicting the geometry of the thrust we created in our model. And looking above the low frictional area, we observe as well that in the foreland we have some initial fabric. Then we have a transitional zone where we have a bit more deformation, where the Kmax axis starts to reorient. And in the hinterland, we get a mix between areas which are penetrative strain affected and also thrust affected. And we get it in the deflection zone. When we zoom in the deflection zone, where the strike slip faults are, we also observe a different orientation of the principal axis. And when we look at the degree of anisotropy, we observe that from the circles towards the crosses in the hinterland, we observe that there is a decrease of the degree of anisotropy. So our morphology is kind of working for analog models, that we can, as its magnetic fabric is depicting the deformation in the model. And as we speak today about visualization, how you visualize this in our models? You can use, for example, these stereographic projections, like these circles with all these different orientations of the principal axis, but you can also work with color codes. For example, this is a recent study which hopefully will publish very, very soon, so stay tuned, where we have one thrust imbricate with back thrust, fore thrust, and forking zones. And here we plot the declination of the principal axis as a color code, and you see that at the thrust, the color code is, or the color is changing. So from a north-south orientation more to a east-west orientation. Also, when you look at the inclination, you see that, or look at the structures, we get a different color or the degree of anisotropy. We also can see gradients. And this is something what we observe, that we also can not only see over a far region from the foreland to the hinterland, some gradients and trends in the change of the magnetic fabric, but also within one thrust imbricate, there is something going on. And this picture below is just a recent study by Ram Weinberger, published 2 months ago, where they use also, it shows data from the Dead Sea Basin, where they have some little folds and took a lot of samples, very dense scheme, and run an interpolation across, in this case, the degree of anisotropy. And you can see by the color code areas of maximum deformation, like in the hinges and the anticlines, the colors are changing quite strongly. So these are one ideas of how to visualize strain. You can also run, I hope this works. Yeah, you can create 3D models. So we have laser scans, you have all this data, and you can create 3D models. And then you can load in your AMS data. And here in this case, we plot the orientation of the maximum axis. And you see that where the structures are, that there is like a strong change indicated by this color change. You can also plot the minimum axis with a different orientation. And so you get an impression of this strain distribution in 3D. And with this, I come to my conclusions that yes, AMS provides a nice strain distribution in our analog models, and we get characteristic sets of magnetic fabric for each structure, and we can reveal gradients. And saying this, I would like to say thank you for the invitation. I'm Tack så mycket. And yes, as Daft Punk is singing, our work is never over. We're still working on it to refine the method, testing different tectonic settings, using different materials and different, modeling techniques. Yeah, thanks.